Hello and welcome everyone to the second podcast for day 35 on population ecology. In this podcast, we're going to cover objectives 3, 4, and 5, and I'm going to use more of a PowerPoint slide presentation style for this particular podcast. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So on the previous couple slides, we were talking about how this population changes over time. There are two basic models. One is the exponential growth model, and one is the logistic growth model. So let's first talk about the exponential growth model. Okay, typically an exponential growth model is not sustainable. Usually at some point it's not going to continue to grow. So let's think about exponential growth models. Here in this graph here we see the year that they're measuring the population of elephants, and here is the number of elephants. We know that the population, the species of elephants, is on a rapid decline because of hunting them for their tusks, illegal hunting of them for their tusks. So what happened is that they placed a bunch of these elephants in a natural reserve called the Kruger National Park. And they did this in the early 1900s or so. And then they monitored them all the time, throughout time I should say. Not all the time, that would be kind of weird following an elephant around all the time. But they monitored their populations over time. And you can see they slowly start to increase, and then finally what happens is they just take off, as shown here. And because of this, we call this the exponential growth of these organisms. They do this because they're in this natural reserve where there's no predation, there's no hunters. I shouldn't say there's no predation. There's probably some predation here, but it's more of a natural predation. But they're protected in this area. Okay. So they have this ability to have this unregulated growth. In the natural environment, outside of this confines, you wouldn't probably see this. Typically, an exponential growth is, as I said earlier, it's not sustainable, and it's really an idealistic model. We rarely see these in regular populations. Now, I might go back to the last slide here as I explained carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is what really regulates how fast that population is going to grow. So here we call this the balance point. We call that the carrying capacity, which is the number of individuals in a population that the environment can sustain. So if we go back to this slide here, at some point this population of elephants, it can't keep doing this, even on the natural reserves, where preserves I should say, where they're not hunted and they have a much simpler life. At some point they're going to hit what we call a carrying capacity, whatever that is. Usually this carrying capacity, maybe there's not going to be enough food, maybe some kind of disease will have an outbreak, and then we're going to start to see probably some kind of leveling off. But once it starts leveling off, that's no longer the exponential growth model. So just recognize that this exponential growth will be limited based upon the carrying capacity. Okay, so as I said on that last slide, many organisms, including humans, can have this really great exponential phase where they just skyrocket. But at some point, there's going to be some factor that's going to begin to limit its growth. It may just stay out here and maintain balance, or it could actually drop sometimes, or it might come back up. It's hard to know what will happen here. It depends upon the organism and its surrounding environment, what's going to happen. But this exponential growth will not last forever. At some point, it's going to hit this carrying capacity. And so over here, we would say that this is, in this example here, this is its carrying capacity. Okay, so as we've said here a few times, but we can kind of repeat it here since it's written here. At some point, the death rate will begin to increase and the birth rate will decrease. And this is usually because of something in the environment. It could be predation, it could be a disease, it could be lack of food, lack of vegetation, it could be due to sanitation, right? As more animals are in the area, there's going to be increased fecal material, and that's going to affect the quality of life of these organisms. So here's a nice diagram explaining this carrying capacity here. And we can see we have nice slow growth, and it starts to pick up rapidly, and then it begins to slow down, and then it begins to stop and rest here at the carrying capacity. Now, based upon this diagram here, we would say it never goes above the carrying capacity. But in reality, sometimes we can exceed the carrying capacity. That's not necessarily a good thing when that happens, but it can happen. As we'll see on this slide here, we have our exponential growth here, where it grows rather rapidly. And then we have what we call the logistic growth, which is what we've been explaining, where you have this slow growth followed by rapid growth, and then it begins to slow, and then we have this steady state. And in this model here, it would never go above the carrying capacity. But as we say here, that in actual populations, it's usually much more complex, where you'll have the exponential growth, and then it'll kind of go up and down around this carrying capacity. Now we know that there are changes in the environment that can cause changes in the carrying capacity of an environment. Some of these changes might be drought, which leads to food shortage. So less rain, you're going to have less rain, and you're going to have less food. Temperature increases the rate of metabolism. Increased temperatures, that is. Environmental pollutants. These could be things that, say, humans dump into the population. They could be pollutants that the animals are creating, and just because their density is getting so large that they are producing more pollutants. And habitat destruction. This is probably the biggest thing, and by and large, this is something we humans are doing to a lot of these populations by destroying their habitats. In addition, we have changes in the size of predator or competitor populations. So if there are two competitors, they're different populations, but they're competing for the same resources. It could be that one is a little bit better at that. So that's going to affect the carrying capacity. Having more predators in an area, that's going to change the carrying capacity. Introducing a new species into this population, either naturally or sometimes we humans have done this, introduce these invasive species. And this will cause a new kind of competition in these environments where the new species usually doesn't have that same kind of predator that'll keep it in check. All right, let's move to the last part of this chapter called life histories. All right, so life histories. The life history of an organism describes the traits that affect its schedule of reproduction and death. Life history traits are shaped by adaptive evolution. They will vary per species and throughout time. These are some of the trade-offs that organisms face as they balance reproducing and surviving. The first one here is reproduction and survival. We call these the Big Bang reproducers. That means they put an incredible amount of energy or investment in reproduction. But the trade-off is that they die shortly after, as we see when salmon swim upriver to spawn. A tremendous amount of energy they place on that, but the good thing is they produce these strong offspring. The bad thing is that they don't survive. So that's a pretty big trade-off. Another one is reproduction and growth. We see this a lot. This example is just talking about a standard beech tree. And we know that the beech tree, and a lot of trees, not just the beech tree, but a lot of trees, they will grow much more slowly in the years that they are producing a lot of seeds. Okay? That way, they're putting a lot of that energy in making seeds. As a result, they don't have enough energy to grow. Now, on the offhand, when in the years they're not producing seeds, that's when they grow a lot more. Another trade-off that organisms consider is the number and size of offspring. Here we're talking about eggs, but it's not just eggs. We can also think about this in organisms that have live births. So there's this kind of delicate balance. You can have lots of progeny in one brood that aren't as strong or aren't as robust and aren't going to survive as well. Or you can have a few large-sized organisms or eggs that survive much better. Often what will happen is in this trade-off, they will have settle for somewhere in between. The medium-sized eggs that produce strong progeny, not quite as strong as if they would just produce a few. So it's this kind of delicate trade-off. And you can think about like where humans fall into this. We typically fall into this category where we have relatively large progeny in retrospect, but very few of them, as opposed to, say, mice who have a lot of progeny over a course of say, a year, but not very many of them will actually survive. Let's think about why a population stops growing. Scientists who study this, they will study the rate of birth, death, immigration, and immigration, and how these factors affect the overall density. If immigration and immigration sort of offset each other, you have equal numbers coming in or going out of the population, then the population will grow and only grow if the birth rate exceeds the death rate. And it will decline if the death rate exceeds the birth rate. And we can think of these sort of factors that determine if the birth rate exceeds the death rate or vice versa. If it's a density dependent factor or a density independent factor. Okay, density dependent factors, these are factors that will affect the birth and death rate based upon that density. So these could be factors like disease, predation, it could be territoriality, toxic waste. As the population gets larger and larger and larger, it will cause a buildup of toxic waste. That could have a negative impact on that population growing or not growing. More toxic waste, you're going to have an increase in death in the death rate. If the population gets much larger, you can have an increased predation because there's more of that organism around. Any predators that eat that particular organism are going to have an easier time finding those organisms. If you look on page 1198 in your textbook, figure 53.18, 5318, it lists these 6 factors: competition for resources, disease, predation, intrinsic factors, territoriality, and toxic waste. All of these are dependent upon the density of that population. Density independent factors are factors that are not based upon the density. So for instance, if you had a situation where there was drought, so lack of rain, it doesn't matter if you have a very high density or if you have a low density. The lack of rain is going to affect certain populations quite a bit. So it doesn't matter upon the density. If there's a forest fire that destroys a large part of a population, that has nothing to do with the density, it's all because of the forest fire, and it affects them, again, regardless of the density. Okay, let's move on from density and dependent and independent factors and begin thinking about these next terms. As we'll see, they relate strongly with density dependency. Equilibrium, this is often called the K factor, or K selection might be a better way of saying it, K selection. And opportunistic is R selection. Equilibrium, these are ones that are going to be more associated with density dependent. So I'm going to put DD for density dependent. And what that simply means is that because as the density increases, you're going to have a drop off in the population. As the population drops off, there's going to be forces that allow it to increase again. So it's kind of kept at this equilibrium. Opportunistic, however, this is going to be more associated with a density independent, DI here, selection pattern. Now, it's hard to kind of lump all species into either an opportunistic or R selection and an equilibrium or K selection. Rather, there usually exists some kind of continuum between these. In nature, it's really difficult to ever put anything into this box that it has to exist in. So let's look at these two organisms, which represent sort of the extremes, but recognize that most of life is going to fall somewhere in between here. All right, so for K-selected or equilibrium species, what we see here is that over time, this population here is going to kind of rise above the carrying capacity, drop below it, then rise again. Over time, it's going to kind of be kept in equilibrium right around the carrying capacity, which is shown by this dotted line. So indeed, it is limited by the carrying capacity. It's not going to drop too far below it or go too far above it. And because of that, it's also density dependent. And over time, because of this density dependency and this kind of reliance upon this carrying capacity, the population size remains relatively stable. The organisms that fall closer to this extreme are going to be larger animals or larger animals that produce larger offspring. They're typically longer-lived animals. They produce fewer offspring, but the offspring they produce are typically much larger. And they also put a lot more investment into the care of their offspring. This is almost always seen when you have larger offspring and fewer of them. The trade-off is that the parents are going to spend more time caring for them and bringing them up to maturity. Now, on the other extreme, we have R-selected opportunistic species. In this case here, you can see here's your population size and over time, and you can see we have rapid increases and then sudden drops. Rapid increases, sudden drops. Rapid increases, sudden drops. This is strictly regulated by reproductive rates. It's not regulated by the density. It's independent of density. It's almost exclusively because of the rate of reproduction. And because of that, what we have is a very unstable population. At various times in the history of these organisms, they will have a very high population and then very low, very high, very low, very high, very low. Okay, they fluctuate. These organisms that are opportunistic species typically are smaller, like we see here with insects. They are short, have much shorter lifespan. They produce many offspring. Most of them won't survive. If we think of the survivorship curve, it's either going to fall into that 1 or 2 category. And essentially, and you can see this when if you were to watch insects and their progeny, they don't typically provide any care for the offspring. No investment into the offspring. Just produce a lot of them and hope some of them live. All right. Well, here's a table that summarizes a lot of what we talked about, particularly towards the end here. And I think this is a pretty good summary. So if you were able to fill out this table, you would have a pretty good handle on a lot of what we're talking about with population ecology. Not everything, but quite a bit of it. So work on that on your own, and I will see you in class tomorrow. And good luck. Let me know if you need anything. Bye.